I'd like now to introduce the next speaker, and it's always wonderful when technology is working, even at 5 a.m. in the morning, because it's 5 a.m. in the morning on the East Coast of the US. Thank you very much, Professor Rifkin, for being with us so early in your day. The biotech century, the age of access, the end of work, the European dream, the hydrogen economy, the empathic civilization, finally, the third industrial revolution. Some of the 19 books, some of them published in 35, translated and published in 35 languages, published by the person who is going to speak to us in a second, Professor Jeremy Rifkin, who has a degree in economics and international affairs. He is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, USA, and the president of the Foundation on Economic Trends. Professor Rifkin, thank you very much for joining us by video conference, and now we are eager to listen to you. I know you have heard the end of the talk by Sunita Narain. She mentioned the US way of life, and I know she'll have a question at the end of your talk, but I told you before, so you know about that. Now we're going to hear you. Thank you so much for joining us. Please.
Thank you, and good morning to all my friends in Europe, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Let me ask, is the volume okay for everybody in the audience? Okay. All right, thanks. Well, let me start on a somber note. I hope it'll end up being a liberating reflection. We've had two events in the last 5 years that I believe signal the beginning of a long end game for the great industrial revolution based on fossil fuels. Let me take you back to July 2008. You remember that month. Crude oil hit a record peak of $147 a barrel on world markets in July 2008. And when oil hit that peak, purchasing power plummeted across the world, and the entire global economy shut down that month. That was the great economic earthquake of the Industrial Revolution. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later was the aftershock. We're still dealing with the aftershock in public policy. We haven't gotten to the earthquake. And until we do, we can't begin to address the enormity of the crisis we face. The reason the global economy shut down at $147 a barrel is simply this. This entire world uses and moves fossil fuels. We grow our food in petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. Our construction materials are made out of fossil fuels. Most of our pharmaceutical products are petrochemical based. Our synthetic fiber, our power, our transport, heat and light, they're all made out of or moved by fossil fuels. We are the oil people. We had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. I'm sure future generations will look back at us and say they were the oil people. So when oil started to go over $100 a barrel in late 2007, all the other prices across the global supply chain went up. At $122 a barrel, we had food riots in 22 countries because we have 40% of the human race living on $2 a day or less. And the price of wheat, barley, rye, and rice were doubling, tripling, and trebling because of the oil price. We had 1 billion people at risk. At $147 a barrel, the prices for everything in the developed and developing world were too high, and the economy shut down. This is an end game. The reason this is happening is we've reached two milestones. Peak oil per capita, 1979, Global peak oil production, 2006. 1979, and we'd taken all the oil reserves we knew we had at that moment and distributed them to all the human beings alive in 1979 and shared them. That's the most each person could have for oil. We found more oil since then, but population rose a lot quicker. So if we distributed all the oil reserves we have on hand today to 7 billion people, there's just simply less to go around. Peak oil per capita. Global peak oil production, that's when half the global oil reserves are used up on the classic Hubert bell curve in geology. What's interesting about it is when half the oil is used up, it's over, because we can't afford the second half. The price is prohibitive. Now, there's been a lot of controversy among geologists about when we hit peak oil. Then in 2011, the International Energy Agency, who we all rely on for our oil forecasting, dropped a bombshell. They said it looks like we peaked on global oil production at 2006 at 70 million barrels of crude oil a day, and will likely plateau down to 69 million barrels at least of crude oil a day. But listen to this. The IEA says it'll take upwards of $8 trillion to get that remaining oil out in the next 20 years. So when China and Asia brought in the developing world into the second industrial revolution in the latter stages at an 8, 9, 10, 11% growth rate, the aggregate demand against the reserves of crude oil were just so great, oil prices go up, all the other prices go up, the economy shuts down. We are now in 5-year cycles, 4 or 5 year cycles of growth, slow down, growth, slow down. It's an end game. Let me explain. In 2009, oil went down to 30 a barrel because there was no economic activity. As soon as we started to replenish inventories in 2010, oil prices went up, all the other prices went up. And in the first quarter of 2012, we hit a smaller peak of 123 a barrel. And Unilever and Colgate-Palmolive, the two major consumer companies, announced profits are down because the oil price forced their consumer product prices up and purchasing power is slowing down again. We are in a second slowdown of the economy. So these cycles of 4 or 5 years of growth and slowdown are here to stay. This is absolutely an end game. Now, we have other fossil fuels. We have tar sands in Canada and heavy oil in Venezuela, shale gas in America and around the world. They're more expensive. They're more scarce fuels. And they also lead to the second major event of the last half decade, and that's Copenhagen, climate change. In December 2009, world leaders come together from 192 countries to address the entropy bill for the industrial age. If we have any engineers in the audience today, you know that we cannot escape the second law of thermodynamics. We are paying the entropy bill. This is not a metaphor. We have spewed massive amounts of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere during the first and second industrial revolutions of the 19th and 20th century. And now the long and short of it is we just can't get enough sun's heat back off the planet because of the global warming gases in the atmosphere. How bad is it? It's much worse than we are willing to acknowledge, either emotionally, intellectually, or in public policy. In 2007, the UN Panel on Climate Change issued its 4th assessment report, 2,500 scientists, 125 countries, 20 years of modeling, and the report was an eye-opener. And at that point in time, our scientists were telling us we may see a 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature on this Earth in this century. That's a middle scenario. Let me put this in perspective. If we only go up 3 degrees in this century, and that's looking conservative now, that takes us back to the temperature on Earth 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. Different world. And what's so terrifying about climate change, it's never explained, and I hope this message gets out. Climate change changes the actual water cycle of the planet, the hydrological cycle. We're the watery planet. Our ecosystems have developed over millions of years based on a steady and slowly changing water cycle, hydrological cycle. Here's the problem. For every 1 degree that the temperature goes up on Earth from climate change, the atmosphere absorbs 7% more precipitation from the ground. It sucks up that precipitation because of the heat. That throws off the whole water cycle of the Earth. That means we have more bitter winter snows, more dramatic spring floods, more prolonged summer droughts. Our ecosystems cannot readjust to this radical shift in the water cycle in a tiny moment in time. They're destabilizing. So now our scientists tell us we are in, right now, in real time, we are in the 6th extinction event of life on this planet. We've had 5 extinction events in the last 450 million years, 5 wipeouts. And every time there was a mass extinction of life, it came quick. The chemistry of the planet shifted in a very small moment of evolutionary time. And on the average, it took about 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost in these extinction events. And now our scientists tell us we are in the 6th extinction event now. And we could lose up to 70% of all the species of life on this planet by the end of the century. James Hansen, the chief climatologist for the United States government, says that at the current projections, if we go up to 450 parts carbon per million, and it looks like we may exceed it, we won't go up 3 degrees. And I want everyone to hear this. We will go up 6 degrees in temperature in this century, and this is a paraphrase, the end of human civilization as we know it. As my wife says, we're not grabbing and grasping the enormity of this moment. This is a species crisis. 99.5% of all the life forms that have ever existed on this little planet in the universe have come and gone. It's hubris to believe that the youngest species, we're the babies in this biosphere, that somehow we're going to beat the odds. So we have to ask the question, what do we do? I want to share an anecdote with you. When Chancellor Merkel became Chancellor of Germany, she asked me to come to Berlin in the first few weeks of her government to help her address the question of how to grow the German economy in the 21st century. Now remember, Germany is the most robust industrial economy per capita in the whole world. When I got to Berlin, the first question I asked the Chancellor is, Madam Chancellor, how do you grow the German economy, or the European economy, or the global economy in the last stages of a great energy era, where the energies are sunsetting, the technologies based on the energies have lost their productivity and their multiplier effect, and the infrastructure made out of carbon is in disrepair, on life support. We need a new economic vision for the world. It has to be compelling. We need a new economic game plan to deliver on that vision. It has to move quickly. It has to move as quickly in the emerging nations as in the industrialized countries. We need to be off carbon, off, by 2035. Not low carbon, off. If we have any chance at all to survive this crisis that's facing the planet, climate change. So we need to step back and ask the question, how do the great economic revolutions in history occur? Because that'll give us a roadmap of the kind of economic vision and game plan we need to develop. The great economic revolutions in history come about when new energy regimes emerge. They make possible more complex civilizations. But then those new energy regimes require new communication revolutions that are agile enough to manage the complexities of the new energy regimes. All throughout history, when energy revolutions converge with communication revolutions and they come together, it changes the economic paradigm. It changes consciousness. It changes history. I wrote a book called The Empathic Civilization, the book before the Third Industrial Revolution. It goes into this paradigm shifts all through history and the shifts in consciousness that result. So I won't go into that this morning. Let me just take the 19th century as an example. First Industrial Revolution. We had a powerful convergence of communication and energy. we went from manual print presses to steam power printing. So we could mass produce volumes of print material very cheaply, very efficiently. The transaction costs were low, like the internet today. And then we introduced public schools, and we created a print literate workforce with the communication skills to manage a very complex, coal-powered, steam-driven rail industrial revolution. Try to imagine organizing the first industrial revolution with a completely illiterate workforce. We couldn't have done it. We needed the communication skills. 20th century, a second industrial revolution, a new convergence of communication and energy. The centralized electricity, the telephone, and later radio and television became the communication media to manage and coordinate a more dispersed auto oil economy, a suburban build-out, and a mass consumer culture. That second industrial revolution is now on life support. The energies are never going to get cheaper. They're more expensive. The technologies are old. The infrastructure on life support. We are, however, right now in Europe and in places around the world, just now seeing a new convergence of communication and energy that could get us to a third industrial revolution, maybe in time, to address the enormity of the crisis that faces us. We had a very powerful communication revolution in the last 20 years, the personal computer and the internet. What's so interesting to me, I may be the oldest person in the room today. I'm a war baby, and that means World War II. I grew up on centralized communication electricity, top down, one to many, radio, television, newspapers, magazines. What's so interesting about the internet as a communication revolution is it's not top down. It's not centralized. It's distributed. It's organized collaboratively. And internet communication scales to lateral power, not centralized power. This, and what's always amazing to me, we did this in 20 years. Today, we've got a third of the human race, 2.5 billion people, with a small cell phone. And this is in the emerging world as well as the industrial world. Small cell phone with a computer, a desktop computer. The new ones are $25, believe it or not. And they're interacting with each other with a distributed collaborative communication mechanism that gives them more lateral power than all the television networks of the 20th century. We did this in 20 years. The internet really started going in 1992. But that's only half the story. Now this internet revolution, which is distributed, collaborative, and lateral power, is now beginning to merge with a new energy regime, distributed energies, which are organized collaboratively and scale to lateral power. It's a perfect fit of communication energy. What are distributed energies? Well, let me compare them to elite energies. Coal, oil, shale gas, tar sands, uranium. These are elite energies. They're not found in the backyard. They're only found in a few places. They require huge military and geopolitical commitments. Massive capital to organize them from the wellhead or under the ground to the end user. What are distributed energies? Now, those are energies when you leave this conference, go home, you'll have all the energy you need in your backyard that you'll ever need. The sun shines all over the world every single day. It's distributed. 45 minutes of sunlight can power the global economy for a year, no problem. The wind blows all over the world every single day. 20% of the world's wind gives us 7 times more power than we need for the whole global economy. Underneath the ground, everywhere in the world, we have a hot geothermal core of energy ready to be converted to our uses. In the rural areas, we have agricultural and forestry waste that can be converted back to energy. In the coastal regions, our urban populations have the ocean tides and waves coming in every day for energy. And wherever we have garbage, we have enough garbage, we can anaerobically convert it in bioconverters back to energy. We have enough of these distributed energies to provide for our little species until kingdom comes. So when the internet, which is distributed, collaborative, and laterally scaled, converges with energies which are distributed, collaborative, and laterally scaled, we have a powerful leap forward in a short time for the human race if we can get there. which means we all have to be on the same page, no mistakes, and hope that we have some luck, because this is a daunting task, what I'm about to outline, but I don't believe there's a plan B. If there is, I don't know what it is. The European Union has made a formal commitment to a 5-pillar third industrial revolution infrastructure which dramatically changes the economic paradigm and takes us off carbon in this half century. I was privileged to develop this plan with the European Union. It was formally endorsed by the European Parliament in 2007, June. And the third industrial revolution now is working its way through the European Commission and in the member states as well. And I should say Germany and Denmark are far ahead on this third industrial revolution game plan. 5 pillars for this new economic infrastructure. Pillar 1, the EU is committed to 20% renewable energy by 2020. A third of the electricity has to be green in every region, including Belgium, in the world. That's a mandate, not a suggestion. Pillar 2, how do we collect distributed energies that are found everywhere? Now, our first inclination years ago was to go to Italy, Greece, and Spain. They have a lot of sun, put in some big solar parks, ship it out on a high voltage electricity line. The Irish have wind, the Norwegians have hydro, centralized and ship it. Now let me say, I don't oppose these more concentrated uses of distributed energies. They're easy, they're quick, they're part of the mix. But what we've learned in recent years is we cannot manage a continental European economy on these centralized uses of distributed power. Not enough load. So if distributed energies are everywhere, why would we only collect them in a few central points? 20th century thinking based on centralized communication and energy, top down. This got us to pillar 2. If distributed energies are everywhere in Europe, why don't we collect them everywhere where there's human infrastructure? Think buildings, buildings, buildings. We have 191 million buildings in the EU. Homes, offices, factories, barns. These buildings around the world use the most energy, create the most CO2. By the way, the number 2 cause of industrial-induced climate change, which we never talk about, is beef production and consumption in animal husbandry. Number 3 is transport. Number 1 is buildings. I say that because not one government leader in 192 countries has made a single statement about the number 2 cause of climate change, beef production and consumption, animal husbandry. How serious are we if we can't even change our diets and move down the food chain somewhat? But the number 1 issue, buildings. They create the most CO2. The goal is to convert every single existing building in Europe to your own personal green micro power plant. Collect solar off the roof, collect wind off the side of your building with vertical wind, collect heat underneath the building with a heat pump, convert your garbage to energy in the building. Pillar 2 jumpstarts construction. This is going to require millions of jobs, thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises to convert the entire building infrastructure of Europe so everyone has their own micro power plant. Here's the analogy. In 1970, we had a few mainframe computers, centralized, a few companies sharing information. Then this young kid, Steve Jobs, comes along and invents the personal computer. Today, a third of the human race is now sending video, audio, and text at near zero marginal cost in cheap cell phones and computers. And we've done that in 20 years, most of it. Similarly, today, we have in Europe and around the world a few power and utility companies. They generate the power. We passively buy it. But already in Europe, with the feed-in tariffs, we now have several million buildings and local sites that are generating their own energy. Germany has, let me talk about Germany. Pillar 1, Germany is already at 20% green electricity as of last year. They're heading to 35% green electricity within 6 years. Germany in Pillar 2 has now converted 1 million buildings. 1 million buildings are producing a little bit of power. So today we have a few million sites in Europe and around the world producing a little bit of distributed power. And 10 years from now, tens of millions of buildings will be producing some of their own power. In 20 years from now, several 100 million buildings on this planet will have been converted to produce some of their own green power. It's moving with the same exponential growth cost curve as the shift from mainframe computers to desktops and cell phones, where it got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and scaled out. We're seeing the same exponential curve now in the harvesting of renewable energy, solar and wind. The next up will be geothermal and then biomass. So that the actual price of these energies, the harvesting technology is going to get so cheap. In 20 years from now, those harvesting technologies will be as cheap as cell phones are today. Same cost curve. And when that happens, the sun off your roof is free. The wind off the wall of your building is free. The heat under your building is free. Your garbage converted energy is free. Just as we created the infrastructure for the communication part of this revolution, that was costly. But now each additional piece of information we send to each other is nearly free. That's going to happen with energy too. Pillar 2. Every building's a power plant. Pillar 3. This is a challenging pillar. You know, the problem is the sun isn't always shining in Belgium. You have cloud cover. And sometimes the wind blows at night. You've got to have the electricity during the day. It's not cooperating. These are intermittent energies. We have to store them. Now, in the EU, we're in favor of all storage. Water pumping, batteries, flywheels, capacitors. We like them all. We've put particular focus, however, on hydrogen at the center of the storage network because it's what we're made out of. It's the basic element of the universe. It carries other energies. It's modular. You can use it in your apartment building or in a utility complex. So here's how it works. If you have a house with a solar panel on the roof, you generate a little electricity. If you don't need some of that electricity, you can put the surplus electricity in a tank of water. Just put the electricity in the water with an anode and a cathode. The hydrogen in the H2O comes out into a tank. It separates. Then when the sun isn't shining on your roof, you take that hydrogen in a fuel cell and convert it back to electricity. So you have 24/7 storage. A tiny, tiny thermodynamic loss in conversion engineers compared to bringing coal, oil, gas, and uranium at every step of conversion and loss from the wellhead to the end user. Pillar 3, storage, hydrogen. Pillar 4 is where the communication revolution of the internet converges with the new energy regime, distributed energies, to create a nervous system for this new economic paradigm. We're using off-the-shelf internet and IT technology to convert the power grid of Europe to an energy internet, a distributed smart grid, an energy internet. So when millions and millions of buildings are producing just a little bit of their own green electricity on site, storing it in hydrogen like we store media in digital form, then if you don't need some of that green electricity at any given time of the day or week, your software can program it. So you can sell that electricity that's green across an energy internet from the Irish Sea all the way to the border of Russia. Just like we create information, store it in digital, share it online. Pillar 3 in Germany, Hydrogenics in our global group is working with E.ON, and they're laying out hydrogen storage across the power structure now. Pillar 4 in Germany, Deutsche Telekom in our group, is now testing the distributed smart grid, the energy internet, in 6 regions of Germany. Pillar 5, this is transport. Electric vehicles are here. Fuel cell vehicles will be out in mass production in 2014 to 2016. We'll be able to plug in our electric and fuel cell vehicles anywhere where there's green energy coming, electricity in the buildings. And wherever we travel in Belgium, there'll be plugs at every parking space. So you can plug back in, get green electricity, or sell your hydrogen back to electricity, or your electricity in your car back to the grid. I mean, if you go to Brussels this morning, right across the Parliament, a block away, you'll see 2 smart cars connected up, being powered right there on the street, and you can go and use those cars for almost nothing. They're right there. This is not academic. These 5 pillars alone are just components. That's all they are. When we connect these 5 pillars, they create a general purpose technology platform, an infrastructure for a completely new economic paradigm that will change society fundamentally and change and shift consciousness in a profound way. The second industrial revolution, it wasn't enough to have the automobile. Then you have to have centralized electricity so they could use mobile electricity with power tools on the factory floor for mass assembly. But then you have to have the highways put in and the gasoline and oil pipelines installed and centralized electricity sent to the rural areas so you could create suburbs and have communications. It all comes together. It's infrastructure. So is the third industrial revolution. And let me say, please do not make the mistake that President Obama made. His heart was in the right place. He wanted a green economy. He still wants a green economy. And our president spent billions and billions of dollars of U.S. stimulus money, our money, on standalone, isolated, siloed projects. He'd finance a battery factory in one state, a solar panel factory in another state, unconnected. He did not understand, and Washington did not understand, that the great economic shifts are communication revolutions converging with energy revolutions, and then the whole infrastructure has to be put together. Now, let me give you an example. In Europe, the feed-in tariffs have been successful. So we have millions of players generating some energy, green energy, pillar 1. But we haven't moved pillar 3 quick enough, the storage, hydrogen storage. So we're losing 3 out of 4 kilowatts. We have wind parks up and they're blowing electricity at night, but we need the wind during the day. We haven't found a way to store it. Same with the sun. In Germany, during high days in the summer, we have negative electricity prices because there's so much sun that the energy companies have to pay the consumers for it. All right? We have to store these energies so we can use them in a consistent way. Also, we have, the feed-in tariffs have been so successful, we have regions now that are 50, 60, 70% green electricity. The problem is, when millions of players try to get green electricity into the grid, they can't do it easily. Because the whole power system, pillar 4, is servomechanical. It's 60 years old. It only goes in one direction, and it leaks 20% of the electricity. So we have to get moving on pillar 4. And then our auto companies in Europe are worried because if the other 4 pillars aren't in, where do they plug their electric vehicles into? They're orphaned. The whole system comes together. The 5 pillars of the third industrial revolution, this infrastructure is power to the people. I mean this literally and figuratively. This is power to the people. It changes the economic paradigm. The music companies did not understand lateral power. When millions of young people came together and started creating software to share music, the music companies thought it was a joke. Then they went out of business. The newspapers and the publishing industry did not understand the distributed collaborative nature, the lateral power, the peer-to-peer power of the blogosphere. And now the newspapers and the publishing industry are narrowing down and threatened with their existence. As powerful as the democratization of information and communication has been with the internet, that's half the story. When the internet starts to organize that communication revolution energy, you have to imagine, we have to imagine, everyone on this planet being empowered in their own neighborhood to generate their own power, but then share it across energy internets that cross continents. Just like we create information, store it in digital, and share it across the social media spaces of the internet. This economic revolution vastly changes the economic model. Now, many of you have been hearing about 3D printing, the new manufacturing revolution. That is the manufacturing arm of a third industrial revolution. It has nothing to do with the second industrial revolution. We now have several hundred companies that are using 3D printing where the printer has open source software, no intellectual property. The software in the printer, just like a printer at home, it codes molten plastic or melting metal, and it directs that molten plastic or metal to layer by layer build up a 3-dimensional product with moving parts. And it pops out of the printer, just like you have with information. Hundreds of companies are doing it. It's moving online. It's called the Internet of Things. It's moving quicker than the communication internet did in 1992. What's interesting about 3D printing is its distributed collaborative lateral manufacturing. So when we start to create a third industrial revolution infrastructure in any region of Belgium, It means that a local small and medium-sized enterprise can be equipped with a 3D printer and began to create their own product lines. And 3D printing uses 1/10 of the material of traditional centralized factories because the software is building up the product. Therefore, no wasted materials. In a centralized factory of a second industrial revolution, the product is cut down, winnowed down, pared down, the materials, then you create the final product. So imagine you're a 3D printer either in rural India or in suburban Belgium, and you're nestled in a third industrial revolution infrastructure, nodal infrastructure. So your factory is producing a product at 1/10 of the materials. Then you're powering your little local SME factory with your own green energy from your producer cooperative in the community. Then you can market your product on global websites like Etsy. Etsy is a website where 900,000 small businesses are on the site free advertising, and 50 million consumers are on the site connecting with these companies, and the marketing cost is nearly zero. Then, if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise in Belgium or in Delhi or in rural and urban, if you want to bring your product to market, you have green logistics and your transport is powered by your own green electricity. So we democratize information with the internet. The internet democratizes energy, so everyone is empowered to create their own energy at near zero marginal cost. Then we use 3D printing in manufacturing, so manufacturing can be local and regional, and the power for the factory comes from your local green electricity, and your logistics comes from your own green power. That's power to the people. The first and second industrial revolution scaled vertically because we had centralized energy, centralized communication. It was expensive. So we had to have centralized factories, centralized logistics, centralized transport in order to scale. The economy of scale was always top down. The third industrial revolution is distributed, collaborative, and lateral. It's lateral power. Now, I should say this is a generational shift. For my generation, lateral power is an oxymoron. How can you have lateral power, peer-to-peer? Power is always pyramidal. It's centralized. From the great hydraulic civilizations before Christ all the way to the second industrial revolution. But for a younger generation that grew up on the internet all over the world, lateral power makes sense because they are invested with each other in great social spaces in a distributed, collaborative fashion, and they're sharing power. You know, when young people on the internet talk about power, they don't use the terms right versus left, capitalism versus socialism. Those are 20th century concepts. When a young person judges institutional behavior, the internet generation, they have a different equation in mind. They ask, is this institutional power, whether it's a government, a political party, a school system, or a business, is this institutional power centralized, patriarchal, top-down, proprietary, and closed? Or is this institutional behavior distributed, collaborative, open, transparent, and lateral power? That's the generational shift. And that's the shift that accompanies the transformation from a centralized second industrial revolution to a distributed lateral third industrial revolution. The European Union, this is the five-pillar plan, it's the plan for the EU. It's the next stage of European integration. Everyone's been asking, is Europe going to move ahead? Is the European dream dead? Is it still alive? What do we do? Now, we know austerity is not enough. We know that new labor market banking reforms are not enough. We can do them, and they're essential. But if we're living off a second industrial revolution whose energies are peak, whose technologies are old, whose infrastructure is in life support, you can't grow, even with austerity, even with the new reforms. So the EU has a golden goose. We have to feed it. We have 500 million consumers in the EU. We have another 500 million consumers in the partnership regions in the Mediterranean, North Africa. That's 1 billion people. What we have to do now is work with each other in every region to lay down this 5-pillar third industrial revolution infrastructure across Europe and the partnership regions so we have a seamless energy internet. We are producing our energy locally, sharing our surpluses on a continental basis, and plugging it into an integrated post-carbon transport system. The 5 pillars across that continent will allow us to integrate Europe into a single market, post-carbon, sustainable, with the principle of subsidiarity at the top, meaning everything starts local and then we connect peer-to-peer rather than top-down. Let me say that the developing world, this is going to move quicker in places in the developing world. I was privileged to work with the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce for 9 months with the young people, the young business leaders on a plan in India. And what we are beginning to realize in the developing world is they can actually move quicker because their liability is their asset. The liability is there's no infrastructure. There's 350 million people in rural India without electricity. 20% of the human race has no electricity. None. And another 20% of the human race has only marginal access to electricity. Without electricity, you can't have a decent life. So in the developing world, because there's no infrastructure in many of these areas, they can leap right in. Let me use an analogy. My wife and I have an old house. We've been renovating for 24 years. It is a bottomless entropic pit. Had we built a new house from scratch, we could have built it in 6 months at a fraction of the cost. So the United Nations has now embraced the 5-pillar third industrial revolution as the development model for emerging countries. I met with Mr. Yamkela a year ago at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in a series of meetings. He's the head of UN Energy, and this has been embraced as the model in the developing world because there's plenty of energy in the emerging world. The resources are there. And so you can begin to create this from the bottom up. There are startup companies now in rural India and sub-Saharan Africa that are doing this like they put in cell phones. Cell phones came in and we didn't see it coming. All of a sudden, millions of people get cell phones in rural areas. There wasn't even any electricity yet. So, for example, you can go into a rural area. There are startup companies doing this that are local, and I know of one company where they give you a solar panel and a cell phone. They lease it to you. The solar panel powers the cell phone and gives you electricity for lighting. Once a week, you call up on your cell phone your credit union and give them $1, which is less than the cost of kerosene, which is polluting. Within a few years, it's paid off and you have the panel. Then you can create microgrids house to house, district to district, flat peer-to-peer power, and move it really quickly like cell phone adaptation did. Let me say that the name of the game in Belgium and Europe and the rest of the world, whether you're in emerging or developed countries, in the next 20 years, the name of the game is energy. Whether any country, any industry, any company survives or fails in the next 20 years will have not much to do with labor costs because they're becoming a smaller part of the mix in production and distribution because of automation, technology displacement. They will have everything to do with energy costs because during this transition period, 20 years, where the old second industrial revolution is on life support, but we have to scale in the 5-pillar third industrial revolution, it's all going to depend on your energy costs, whether you're in Belgium or in Senegal or in Hong Kong, wherever you are. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret I would like you to spread to your colleagues in Belgium that no economist wants you to know. It's a dirty little secret in classical and neoclassical economic theory. What is the nature of productivity? What is the nature of growth? Now, you would think economics would know what it is, correct? How do we become productive and grow? When Robert Solow won the Nobel Prize for economic growth theory, he let the cat out of the bag. And Robert Solow said, we used to believe, and still do believe, in the economics field, that the key to productivity and growth is at 2 factors, machine capital per worker and improve the worker's performance. But Mr. Solow said when we track the Industrial Revolution, we find out something interesting. Machine capital per worker and worker performance only accounts for about 14% of all the productivity and growth. So Dr. Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize winner, said, where did the other 86% of the productivity and growth come from the Industrial Revolution? He said, quote, "This is a measure of our ignorance." Can you believe economists don't know? We now know. 30 years later, we know. Global economists in my group, Bob Ayers over at INSEAD, Skip Leitner in our group, many others have done the studies. They're incontrovertible. When you track the Industrial Revolution, we find that the other 86% of growth and productivity is efficiencies, thermodynamic efficiencies. Now, any engineer in this room today could have explained this to us, because economics is simply borrowing low entropy available matter and energy, and matter is energy. We take it from nature, we transform it, we convert it into goods and services, and we lose energy every time we convert it. And then eventually everything we make goes back to nature for recycling. It's the first and second laws of thermodynamics. It's the energy laws that govern economic activity. So here's my point. Whether any company or any industry or any country survives or fails in the next 20 years will depend on their energy cost. To the extent that you can reduce your energy cost across your whole supply chain, and remember, even rare materials are embedded energy. To the extent you can reduce your energy costs, increase your thermodynamic efficiencies, this dramatically increases your productivity, but in a sustainable way, because it moves with the flows of renewable energies. It's local, it's distributed. So when people say, can we still have a quality of life, not greed, but as Gandhi once said, there is enough resources on this planet for everybody's needs, but not everybody's greed. Mr. Gandhi, we should take that moniker and put it across the world. With the third industrial revolution, we can radically reduce the energy cost by increasing the efficiencies, increase our productivity by using less electricity, less energy, less resources, and increase our productivity dramatically. So, you know, the old argument where the environmentalists say we need to be more sustainable and efficient, and the business community says, no, we need growth. Growth depends on efficiencies and sustainability. It's actually how you measure 85%, 86% of productivity and growth. So that means more prosperity, less use of energy, more efficiencies. Let me say in the last few minutes, I think this third industrial revolution is common sense. These 5 pillars are pragmatic. The technology is here, we need to scale it. Obviously, we have to get off carbon. That means we go to distributed renewable energies. That's what bathes this planet. That's what maintains life on this earth. In pillar 2, obviously, we have to collect all these energies that are everywhere, so we use human infrastructure, the buildings, to collect the energies. Pillar 3, we know we have to store these energies because they're intermittent. So we have to put in hydrogen and other storage so we have a 24/7 supply. Pillar 4, we know we can't go it alone, each building. We have to share our energies that we generate with each other across continents. That's an energy internet. And pillar 5, we need to create electric and fuel cell transport that's post-carbon so we can plug it in to the other 4 pillars. If this isn't the plan, I have no idea what it could be. And if someone would like to step forward and tell me what another plan is for saving this economy and saving our species, I would like to hear it. But even with this plan, which is common sense, it's emerging. I should say it's a huge conversation in China in the last 6 months. The new leadership in China is having a massive conversation across China on all 5 pillars of this third industrial revolution. I was proud to see that the book was the #1 book in China this year, and that made me happy. It was a surprise, and a pleasant surprise. This is a robust conversation across all levels of the Chinese economy now, these 5 pillars. The third industrial revolution is not an energy plan, It's not a climate plan. It's an economic paradigm plan that actually addresses climate and energy really quickly. It gets us off carbon. But even with a good plan, we have one more thing missing. I personally don't think we're going to get there in time just with the technology. We have to have a radical shift in human consciousness in one generation that separates us from our children. We need to begin to think in a different fashion. We need to begin to think as a human species. We need to start to see our fellow creatures as our extended evolutionary family. And we need to take our spatial horizon, our sense of identity and loyalty, and broaden it to the indivisible community we all live in, the biosphere. It doesn't mean we give up blood ties, religious affiliations, national identity. But we need to expand our empathic identification beyond our families, expand our empathic identification beyond our religious ties or our national identity. And we have to extend that empathic sensibility so we begin to see the human race as a family, our fellow creatures as the family, and the biosphere as our indivisible community. The biosphere is the sheath from the stratosphere to the oceans, where all the biochemical and living processes interact to sustain life on this beautiful little oasis in the universe. I'm guardedly hopeful we can move from geopolitics to biosphere consciousness in one generation. Let me explain why I'm guardedly hopeful, only guardedly hopeful. We have young 14-year-old kids in Belgium coming home from school. And they're saying to Dad, why are you using so much water while you're shaving? You're wasting it. Or saying to Mom and Dad, why is the television light, that red light on, we're not even using the television? Or why do we have two cars? Why not car share? And this is the one particularly fond to me. We have a lot of young people coming home, even in Belgium and Europe and America, and they're asking, where did this piece of steak come from or this hamburger on my plate? Did this hamburger or steak come from a rainforest? Did they have to destroy the tree canopy for 4 inches of topsoil to graze the cow for my hamburger? When they destroyed the tree canopy to graze the cow, what happened to all the plant and animal life that lived in that canopy? Did they go extinct? And if the trees are destroyed, there's no longer a sink to absorb CO2 from industrial activity, which means the temperature of the planet goes up, and some farmer 10,000 miles away is getting floods and droughts and can't feed their children because of the hamburger on my plate. What the young people around the world, from India, the US, China, Europe, are learning is ecological footprint. They're learning that everything we do has an ecological footprint that affects the well-being of some other community, some other family, some other creature, some other ecosystem. They're learning, as the previous speaker said, and it was music to my ears, they're learning to think systemically in an interdisciplinary fashion. They're really realizing that we are all part of one indivisible single community, and our well-being depends on our relationship not only to each other, but our other fellow creatures that make up this biosphere community. That's biosphere consciousness. That requires that we begin to develop an empathic civilization. Can we do it? You know, I don't know. I have a European director who has a 6-month-old baby who will be alive in the 21st century, likely, maybe. I wonder what life will be like. We have to believe we can do it. We have to believe that we have the time and that the feedback loops have not taken us over to an extinction event that's irreversible. It means we have to double our efforts. Now, here in this room, we have really the educators and the scientists and the researchers and the policy people, the business people that can begin to move this narrative. What's missing now is the narrative. We have a lot of individual siloed efforts among environmentalists and social entrepreneurs and NGOs. We have to actually move the narrative of a third industrial revolution. We have to be willing to work together and bring all 3 sectors together in Belgium, which is the public sector, the government, at the local, regional, and national level, with the business community at the local, regional, and national level, and most importantly, the civil society, the NGO community at the local, regional, and national level, so we can bring together public capital, market capital, and social capital, and together create a collaborative framework to move this economic revolution, this third industrial revolution forward, and with it, biosphere consciousness. So in closing, let me say this. I know that most of the people in this room today, many of you have been engaged in this struggle your whole life. And you have given your life's effort to finding a way that we can live in a more humane and just and sustainable world. We need to redouble our efforts now, because if we can't get this right in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to lose the window. So I'm hopeful that we can reduce the temperature on the planet, create a new economic paradigm, start to think in terms of a human race embedded with our fellow creatures in one biosphere, and hopefully begin to replenish this beautiful planet we live on. It's a worthy mission. Thanks for the privilege of being with you this morning.
Professor Rifkin, fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and I totally agree with you that we can definitely do this. The vision that you've outlined is within our reach. Especially when I come from India, we look at the issue of distributed energy as the way ahead. Distributed water management, distributed energy. But the question that I have for you is what worries us, and I'd look forward to your answer on this, is where do you see are some of the biggest obstacles for making this happen? And really, how do you get your own country, the United States, to take this message more seriously?
Let me say that I think that, of course, there are challenges. When we move in with a great paradigm shift, old interests are threatened by new possibilities. So obviously, the global energy companies have not been too pleased with what we're talking about, but we don't need them, because people power, the ability to produce our energy locally, as you say, in a distributed fashion, it's going to overwhelm the centralized energy operations. And some energy companies may make some gestures to move toward the new third industrial revolution paradigm. I think that there are entrenched political interests, some entrenched business interests. I'm not overly concerned about them, because we have a bigger elephant in the room, which is the construction industry, IT, electronics, transport, and more importantly, 7 billion people who can now be empowered to produce their own energy, to manage their lives, to manage their food production, manage their water, and manage everything else. It's a very dramatic shift to lateral power. And I think it's a generational shift. I think anyone my age just cannot grasp lateral peer-to-peer power. Anyone under 30 can. Good. I would say that my country is a problem. This third industrial revolution is moving very quickly in Europe, parts of Europe, and now China. In the last 6 months, all 5 pillars in China. And it's moving in the emerging nations. In India, I know you have a robust discussion among NGOs, and you're moving the idea of distributed power very, very aggressively within the NGO community and within the small business community in India. The US and Canada may be the outliers here. And what's so ironic is that the US created the first half of the third industrial revolution, which is the internet, the communication management tool. But then it stopped cold and didn't close the deal by using the internet technology developed in Silicon Valley to manage distributed renewable energies so that all of us could share energy on an energy internet like we share communication. We stopped cold. And instead of closing the deal, we're now moving to shale gas and tar sands and coal. Whereas Europe and China and India and the rest of the world is beginning to look toward a third industrial revolution, internet, renewable energy, distributed. My fear is we have a devil's bargain here, because shale gas is there and tar sand, we somehow think it's going to make us energy independent. It's ridiculous. When you put shale gas and tar sand on global markets, the change is almost irrelevant. Yet we have our powerful energy companies and power and utility companies in the U.S. have sold the American public the idea of energy independence. They put advertisements on TV. They elect people to Congress. And I'm afraid that if we lock ourselves in to shale gas and tar sands and old, clunky, centralized power plants of the 20th century for the next 30 years, the U.S. and Canada will be second-tier nations within less than 30 years. I'm hoping that California can blow the winds east, because I think on the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington State, their sensibilities are more in tune with India and China and Europe on this. I think the Northeast, the U.S., the New England states as well. But I'm not sanguine about the prospects. I'm guardedly hopeful, though, that California, which is the 7th largest economy in the world, and the governor's an old friend of mine, Jerry Brown, I'm hoping that maybe California can move the way the rest of the world is moving and hopefully help the rest of the United States. It's tough at this point.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the way you would reconcile your way of the third revolution with the equity principle emphasized by Sunita Narain just before. The first and the second revolution were driven by personal profit seeking, but today the huge concentration of wealth could be an obstacle to the change you are calling for. So, for instance, when you give the examples of children, we know that children ask a good question, but we also know that these questions are very weak compared to the diseducation they receive through advertisement. So do we need a change of attitude toward profit seeking as a goal, and how this change could be possible? Thank you.
Oh, thanks for asking that question. You know, all through history, if you know the communication energy matrix of a civilization at the get-go, the kind of communication and the kind of energy that it's managing, you can get a pretty good idea of how the power is going to be distributed, literally and figuratively. So I would urge you to read The Empathic Civilization, the first of these 3 books, because you'll see it traced through history. The interesting thing about the first and second industrial revolution is because the energies were expensive, you had to have a massive amount of capital. And the communication was centralized based on those energies. To manage the energies of fossil fuels were what we needed for electricity. They had to be very capital intensive and centralized. So because the communication energy were expensive, centralized, and capital intensive, we had to vertically scale all of our economies with centralized factories, supply chains, logistics, etc. And the proof is in the pudding. When you look at the end of the second industrial revolution today, the pyramid is pretty interesting. Now let me say, all of us in the developed world, at least, are fundamentally better off than our ancestors before the first industrial revolution. Agreed? But it's also true that those who control the pyramid are disproportionately better off. So today we have 3 out of the 5 largest publicly traded companies in the world are energy companies. That's not even the state-owned companies. Underneath them on the pyramid are 10 banks, investment banks, which control much of the investment. And underneath them are 500 publicly traded companies that feed off the communication energy matrix that's centralized. And those 500 companies, their revenue equals 1/3 of the GDP of the whole world. That's power. What's interesting about the third industrial revolution is because it's distributed, collaborative, and relies on lateral scale, it requires hundreds of millions and billions of people each becoming entrepreneurial, but the success is measured by collaboration in deep continental networks. We share energy, we share resources. It creates a fundamental shift in terms of economic justice because the power is not top-down. The power relies on peer-to-peer collaboration, as on the internet with social spaces. I believe what we're beginning to see emerge is a new commons for the 21st century. And what we're beginning to see, at least in the communication side and now among a younger generation, is a shift to a globally networked commons where more and more of the economic activity is shared in vast networks. From sharing automobiles to sharing basic food items and clothes and everything else. We are moving to a new idea of a network global commons. So there will be economic activity in the market with profit, but we're going to see increasing economic activity in the social commons that's emerging. And the fastest growing employment sector in the world today is the not-for-profit NGO community. In 42 countries surveyed, this is the fastest growing employment sector. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, isn't the not-for-profit community, which is the commons, the civil society, isn't it parasitic? It relies on government grants or corporate philanthropy. Well, actually not so. Johns Hopkins has done 2 great studies, and they found that in 42 countries surveyed, over half the income of not-for-profit NGOs is fees for services. So what I suspect we're going to see is a proliferation of cooperatives, producer cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, banking cooperatives, in the nonprofit realm, in which we'll be able to come together and cluster laterally scaled in our communities and our regions. And if thousands of us and millions of us begin to come together and collaborate in cooperatives, in not-for-profit organizations, to create energy cooperatives and small and medium-sized 3D printing cooperatives and many other cooperatives, this doesn't take us back to the pre-industrial age of small craft and that romantic vision. But this does take us forward to the idea that we can live together in a distributed, collaborative, and sustainable and just way. So I'm again guardedly hopeful, but I'm not naive after 45 years in this about the challenges and the power interests that we're going to have to deal with. But we have a better story. The first mission here is to get the story out. We live by narratives. Right now, we are all talking about our individual little projects. We have to, I think, begin to see this third industrial revolution economic paradigm as a narrative and biosphere consciousness as our story for the centuries to come. If we can do that, then the passion will be there to move all of the infrastructure into the community really quickly.
Mr. Rifkin, I'm completely agreeing with the concept of third industrial revolution. My problem is, as I'm working in solar energy since about 30 years, it will cost a lot of money. And where will this money come from? I don't believe it will come from capitalists because they are so blind, so greedy. So I think we need a big Keynesian revolution to succeed in that problem. And when we see what the central bank in Europe is doing, rather than maybe Baron Bernanke had a better opportunity to print money. So to save the planet, I would say the value of money is peanuts against what we are challenging for the planet.
May I suggest we also take the next question, and so Professor Rifkin can answer if he agrees to both at the same time. Professor Hans Berger, member for Scientific Committee, an economist, as the next question.
Thank you. Professor Rifkin, I think your narrative is fascinating. We should go for it. However, what about a fourth industrial revolution right along with it? And the idea is the following. What do you make first of the problem of how long we can keep up absolute decoupling, which is, I guess, what you have in mind, right? Producing more with less net energy being used, right? Can that go on for a long time, you think? Second, what do you make of the rebound effect? You haven't talked about it much in your talk. I suppose you have ideas about that. How do we avoid, that we lose the gains from energy efficiency to increase consumption, especially if more people get rich and population grows? In other words, don't you think at some point there's bound to be a need to actually reduce not only energy use per unit produced, but actually to reduce the numbers of units produced and consumed, even if we have these 3D printers, even if they use 10 times less matter, and so on? Thank you.
In terms of where the money comes from, in the EU, we have the next 7-year plan for the use of European Union regional development funds, 400 billion euros coming up for the next 7 years. And the question is, how will that be used? Because that 400 billion euros in regional development funds for 2014 to 2020 can be leveraged against much more of that in terms of financing from the private sector and elsewhere. Yeah, the problem is this. I'll give you an example. We have 80 billion euros in unspent structural funds from the last 7 years. And you know, they've been committed to regions, and you know where they're not being spent? In Italy, Greece, and Spain. Committed to regions, never spent. In those 3 suffering countries. And that's a shame. But now the 400 billion euros are coming up. And at the EU level, at the European Commission, I've been working with Vice President Tajani, the industry minister. I talked about this in my keynote address at the EU Growth Summit in May, and I said, look, let's be realistic here. We have regions that waste money. And we cannot have that 400 billion euros spent so some region builds an airport no one uses, a bridge no one goes over, a road nobody needs, because some local business wants to make some money off regional funds. It's a complete waste. What we need to do is ensure that that next round of European structural funds are used so every region can lay out a third industrial revolution nodal infrastructure and start connecting across regions, across national boundaries, so we can move this infrastructure across Europe. If we waste that next round of structural funds and the opportunity to leverage it with other funds in the next 7 years, I guarantee you the EU will not make it. It will maybe flounder, but it will not make it to European integration. So we need to exert some pressure at the regional level. We have a coalition in Europe of the European Small and Medium-Sized Business Federations, Co-op Europe, the Consumer Federations, and Euro Chambers, and they're in each region. We now need to press for each region to create its own master plan to move this along. I had an interesting week this week. We had a delegation come from Walloon, from the government of Walloon. We had 12 people, ministers, cabinet people from Walloon. We spent 6 hours with my global policy team and experts from Walloon in Wallonia, and it was a very interesting meeting. Here's a region that, along with its sister region, Nord-de-Calais, these are the regions, these 2 bordering regions that created the first industrial revolution. They created it. And so what's interesting now, we had this long discussion with the Walloon region, and I met with the premier of the region earlier, a few months ago. And right now we're beginning a master plan with your sister region, Nord-de-Calais, the Lille region. It seems to me these regions are ideally positioned as they led the first industrial revolution, dropped off a little bit in the second industrial revolution, to lead a third industrial revolution for Europe, cross-border. So I'm hopeful that if we have leadership, political leadership, business leadership, NGO leadership in each region, we can begin to do this. And we can't waste any more time. And we can't just throw up our arms and say there's nothing we can do. We can move this. And I have no doubt the technology's here, it can be scaled, and it can move very, very quickly. And here's my last thought on this. The minute you lay down infrastructure, you have jobs, businesses, and income day one for 40 years when you lay down infrastructure. You don't have to wait to the end of the line till the whole infrastructure's in. The moment you start, you have jobs, businesses, income for 40 years. When we laid out the interstate highways in America in the 1950s to the 1980s, connected the country, developed the suburbs, brought centralized electricity to the rural areas, that was 40 years of infrastructure work. Then we lived off that infrastructure for another 15. So I think this can be done. I think the money is there, not just at regional funds and private equity, that there's all sorts of ways that from crowdsourced funding to cooperative funding, that this money can be brought to bear. There's plenty of money. There's so much money out there, it's just not being invested because nobody wants to invest in an old second industrial revolution infrastructure. If the narrative is right and the passion and commitment is there, the money comes. The money comes. Create the plan, the money will come. I guarantee it. If Germany can do it, if Denmark can do it, why can't Belgium and everywhere else? It can be done. Now, in terms of the second question, even if we can reduce our energy costs and increase our efficiencies, is there a point where we're using that energy to create so much material goods that we still have a problem? Well, yes, and in the third industrial revolution, I talk about the potential entropy bill if we had unlimited distributed energy. Energy converts matter. And of course, we have a problem with rare earths, we have a problem with recyclability. But we are also starting to develop new materials through nanotechnology, which doesn't rely on bulk materials. Nanotechnology is starting to move exponentially by communication and renewable energy. We are beginning to have breakthroughs where we can take basic atoms and begin to connect them in molecules that then can be arranged from everything from potential synthetic food all the way to new products that we use. So we have to think that out. And here's what I said in the book. We have 40% of the human race, us, in the industrial world, living way beyond our sustainable ecological footprint. And I do it, all the folks in the room do it. On the other hand, we have another 40% of the human race that has a very small, as the former speaker said, a very small ecological footprint, maybe a lot of population, but actually smaller footprint, but they're in dire poverty. What we are learning in the new studies on happiness may get us to this new question of what kind of quality of life we want to create. All these studies on happiness, and many of you in the room probably anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists have looked at this. The happiness studies show that if you're very poor, living on $2 a day, scavenging on a garbage dump for food for your children, you can't extend empathy to the polar bears and the penguins on the poles. You're looking for survival. We also know from the happiness studies, if you're poor and you become, generate more wealth, you become happier and happier, up to a certain threshold. And this is what's interesting. The studies show once people become comfortable with the conveniences of life at a threshold, each additional source of wealth makes them less happy, and eventually the wealth makes them unhappy because the possessions possess us. They take over. We think more about the possessions than we do our quality of life. So I think the mission here is for those of us who are living on with too big an ecological footprint, we need to shift from quantity of life to quality of life. It's going to make us happier. It's going to allow us to live in a more sustainable, collaborative commons, if you will, and allow the opportunity for those who are in dire poverty to move up to the threshold of comfort, and we meet there. And then the new dream is really not personal wealth. The new dream, which I think is a European dream, I think it's a dream in India, I think it's a dream among the Chinese and all over the world, is not more and more individual wealth. It's quality of life. Quality of life requires the whole community. Quality of life means no one gets left behind. Quality of life means you have to balance market and social forces. Quality of life means that social capital is more important than market capital. Quality of life means that we're part of one indivisible biosphere. So I think if we can begin to see the new way we want to live as quality of life rather than quantity of material possessions, it moves us more toward the idea of a global commons, living in a biosphere community. That's my hope. As I say, I understand this is a daunting task. I don't see any plan B, any alternative. So my hope is that all the folks in the room today, that have been involved in these efforts for so long in all of your academic disciplines and professional disciplines, I'm hoping that we can spread the word around the world, collaborate in deep social spaces, make this third industrial revolution happen, and get to biosphere consciousness before it's too late. Thank you.